One of the things that I have been concerned with in my own work over some period of time, probably in fact a long period of time, is the question of human free will. And this is a long-standing problem, you might say, in philosophy, in theology, and in some of the social sciences and some of the hard sciences as well, as we try and puzzle over what it is for human beings to have free will, what even free will might be, and how we might be people who are moral agents and are responsible agents. In other words, whether we are responsible for the actions that we perform, whether we're praiseworthy and blameworthy is one way of putting it, right? So if we do certain sorts of things and they're free actions, and whether we're free at the moment of choice. Now, there are all sorts of reasons why you might think that's an important question, independent of theological questions, right? I mean, you might just think it's important to know whether we're responsible for the actions that we perform. And there are ways in which that is really important in all sorts of areas of life. Another area that I'm interested in is legal theory, jurisprudence. And in criminal law, for example, questions about moral responsibility are obviously of fundamental importance, since what lawyers call black letter law, in other words, the law that's encoded in actual laws that are enacted every day in the courts, black letter law presumes that human beings have free will and human beings are morally responsible. And that's why someone can get convicted for a felony and first-degree murder and stuff like that, because it turns out they were morally responsible for what they did. But of course, there's an important sense in which this question of free will is a theological question and a philosophical question at root. And it's that sort of question that I've tried to spend at least some of my research time on over the course of a number of years now, and tackling it in various different ways. One way is to try and think about human free will in relation to a particular theological context. And I work in a kind of theological tradition, if you like, or a theological community called the Reformed tradition, which is a certain way of approaching theology, has certain methods and assumptions and so on. And in Reformed theology, there's a history of looking at questions of free will in a particular way, and that particular way emphasizes God's sovereignty, or his overall control of the world that he creates, and tends to think of human freedom as only something that must fit under this overarching sense that God is in control of everything. So the Reformed tend to say, well, God ordains all that comes to pass, and our freedom must be commensurate with that. There must be some sense in which we're free to the extent that God ordains what we do. But that seems to be problematic. People immediately want to ask the question, how can I truly be free if God's ordaining all that comes to pass? That's a long-standing theological conundrum, okay? And of course that conundrum's to do with free will. So one of the things I've been looking at is how it is that the Reformed understand this, and whether there are ways in which the way that Reformed theology is thinking about this can be broadened out. You know, can we have an account of these things in Reformed theology that has a stronger or richer account of human freedom in relation to God's overarching sovereignty? And so I've been thinking about that in the context of what I've called libertarian Calvinism, which is just basically a kind of made-up phrase for this kind of richer account of freedom in relation to God's overarching control of all that takes place. So that's one area in which I've been thinking about this. But of course, there's ways in which that can be brought into this psych science discussion as well. Because what we think about these questions of human free will in a theological context has also a kind of analogue in the way in which that's been discussed in psychology and in cognitive science in particular, and in the related neuroscience literature. One of the worries there is that a lot of the neuroscientific literature suggests that human beings are not free, that we are sort of machines made of meat, we're kind of automata. In other words, we act on the basis of certain things that are happening in our brains, and although we may think or we may seem to be free, that the actual sensations that we have of freedom are not actually anything more than sort of causally inert. In other words, they don't actually bring about the change. They don't do anything to make me freely choose one thing rather than another. That what's actually going on is something that's entirely a brain state, and we simply have this kind of sense that we're free, then that sense doesn't really track with what's actually happening. That's the worry, right? And certainly some people working in the psych science have taken the view that maybe freedom, free will, is an illusion. It's an illusion that we have kind of concocted after the fact, but it doesn't actually track what's happening in our brain, and it's not tracking with us psychologically speaking at root. And that raises all sorts of fundamental questions that has a bearing on all sorts of related topics. Of course, it has a fundamental bearing on how we think about law, for example, but it has a fundamental bearing on how we think about these things theologically. If it turns out that we don't truly have free will, then how does that impact what we think about human beings in relation to God and how God ordains things? Because fundamentally, it looks like in Christian theology that we must be morally responsible and free in order to choose or refuse divine grace, in order to choose or refuse salvation, in order that our own destiny in relation to eternal things may be set. So that is a pretty important and complicated set of questions, and I'm still enmeshed in that at the moment and still trying to work through ways in which what's happening in the neuroscience and the psych science as well may be filtered into a theological context, and how we might make sense of some of these issues, whether in fact we need to find new models for thinking about human freedom in relation to God, whether we can push back against this claim from some of the psychologists, people like Daniel Wegner, that freedom is an illusion. And if we do push back, how we push back and on what basis. Now, there are, of course, resources on both sides, and there are always more than one way of looking at these questions. And what I'm trying to do at the moment is plot my way through this kind of complex literature to try and come to some resolution of this issue of how it is that we're free and have free will and are morally responsible creatures if God is really in control of all that takes place. I mean, free will isn't necessarily an all or nothing thing, right? I mean, it might be, but it seems much more plausible that you might have degrees of freedom under different circumstances, and that, of course, there are certain situations in which we're not free at all. But what we're interested in those sorts of issues, or those sorts of situations in which free will has some bearing. So, for example, if someone knocks your leg, a doctor knocks your leg with one of those patella hammers, and you have a reflex action, well, you weren't free to act in that way, but we don't tend to think that you're morally responsible for your leg shooting out when you're hit with a patella hammer. But when I'm deciding whether I slap my grandmother or kiss my grandmother, if I make the wrong decision and slap my grandmother, well, then we would want to hold you morally responsible, normally speaking, if we understood that you were acting freely, you weren't coerced, you weren't under the influence of some kind of drugs or whatever it might be, that if you do act freely in performing an action that turns out to be an immoral action, slapping your grandmother rather than kissing your grandmother being a trivial example of that, then significant moral issues are raised by that. So I do think that there's degrees of freedom depending on the circumstances that we're talking about, and there are ways in which the kind of context problematizes what it is that we're dealing with and how we resolve the problems that are raised by the question of free will itself. I mean, coercion is, in a sense, antithetical to freedom, you might think. But there might be a difference between that and the distinction between freedom and things being ordained by God, right? No responsible theologian is going to want to say that if God ordains all things, it's coercive. That's going to be a problem. Everybody agrees that's going to be a problem. The question is whether, if God ordains all things, that very claim implies some kind of coercion. God's forcing you to do certain sorts of things. And I think responsible theologians are going to want to resist that claim. They're going to want to say, no, there's got to be some sense in which whatever control we think God has over the created world, it's got to be consistent with human moral responsibility. If it isn't, then there's a problem. How you resolve that question is really one of the long-standing fundamental philosophical and theological conundrums that is part and parcel of what we're trying to deal with still today. How can we be said to be free and morally responsible given these theological claims about God's creating and sustaining the world that we live in? So I think there's a pragmatic question about free will. If you believe that you have free will, then you may act in, or you may think that you're acting in a certain way consistent with that, and that may have certain benefits, and that's an important issue, I think. But underlying the kind of pragmatic benefits of free will, in other words, its kind of practical implications for everyday living, is this more fundamental question about whether we actually have free will at all. Because, of course, we might think that we have free will even though that's an illusion. In other words, even though we're mistaken in that belief, like we can be mistaken about all sorts of things. I can be mistaken as a pre-modern human being in thinking that it's the sun that's traveling across the sky from one end to the other of the day, when in fact it's our planet that's revolving around the sun. So there are all sorts of ways in which we can have mistaken beliefs about the world around us and who we are. The question with free will then is whether we are mistaken about our human freedom, whether the pragmatic side of things is just a mistake, an illusion, or whether it's in fact tracking with what's really the case, whether we truly are free and morally responsible agents. And that, it seems to me, is a question that's at the heart of much theology and philosophy, as well as what's going on in some of this cognitive science and neuroscientific literature.